The 1965 Immigration Act has to be seen first and foremost as a civil rights measure. It was passed at that time when the U.S. Congress was passing a variety of civil rights laws, of course the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And those laws eliminated discrimination, racial discrimination, prohibited racial discrimination in public accommodations. And there was a feeling in Congress that that same notion of ending discrimination should also be applied to U.S. immigration policy. Up until 1965, U.S. immigration policy was heavily biased in favor of Europeans, and in particular Northern and Western Europeans. Tens of thousands of immigrant visas were reserved for Northern and Western Europeans, while Southern and Eastern Europeans, and especially Asians and Africans and Middle Easterners, had very little chance to immigrate to the United States. They were discriminated against on the basis of their national origins. And there was a feeling across the country and in Congress that it was time to end that discriminatory practice. So the 1965 Immigration Act abolished what had been this national origin quota system that had been in place for more than 40 years. People from all countries, nationalities had more or less an equal opportunity to immigrate to the United States. So it was a really landmark law in the history of U.S. immigration law.
The big watershed event in immigration history until 1965 was the law of 1924. Until that time, America's borders had been pretty open to immigration. Of course, at that time, most of the immigrants came from Europe, but increasingly from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. And that was creating a problem, because these people were different from the Western European immigrants who had come before, who were assimilating quite easily. And I don't think there was ever going to be a big problem with Italian immigration or Eastern European non-Jewish immigration. Those people were a little more difficult to assimilate, certainly. But the big problem was Jewish immigration. Jewish immigrants came to this country, and they were very, very different from the people who were here before. And the most important difference was that they were deeply committed to these leftist political agendas. If you go over to Eastern Europe at that time, political radicalism was a Jewish subculture. A lot of them were intensely Zionist and so on. There was this hotbed because Jews were under extreme pressure in Eastern Europe. Their populations had expanded. A lot of them were impoverished, and their response to this was to become politically radical. So when they came to this country, they were A, poor, but they were B, politically radical. A lot of them were Zionists. They were extremely intense. These were the people who were organizing all these radical leftist movements. They were revolutionary. They supported the Soviet Union. And Americans were just horrified at this. And beginning actually early in the 20th century, there was attempts, and even in the 1890s, to shut down immigration. Jewish activist organizations were at the forefront of keeping it open. And of course their main interest in those years was to get more Jews over from Eastern Europe. So there was a movement in this country to end this free immigration from Europe or elsewhere. And so it came to the head in 1921. They finally passed a law. The purpose of the law really was to create an ethnic status quo. They didn't try to ship the people back that were already here. But they felt that these people were not assimilating well, and we needed a timeout. And the whole point was to create an ethnic status quo. So the idea in the 1924 law that finally solidified all this was to retain the ethnic proportions that were in the country as of the 1890 census, and then later as of the 1920 census. So the point was to have an ethnic status quo. So the percentage of each ethnic group in the country future immigration would be based on what percentage you were of the country as of 1920. This seemed fair to the people who were behind it, but of course Jewish activist organizations rejected this. They wanted more of their people to come over here. They described it as racist and so on. And basically what was going on was that the great majority of the people in the country were finally saying that they had an ethnic interest in preventing future immigration. They wanted the country as it was. They wanted to be a European, Western European culture, that other groups were welcome, and that they would welcome their contributions, but they did not want to be overwhelmed. They didn't want to lose the culture and the ethnic mix that was characteristic of the country at that time. Of course, Jewish organizations lost this battle. So then, after the 1924 bill passed, Jewish organizations didn't stop trying to change it. But then, in the 1930s, you had the Great Depression, and so it was even harder to change the law because people, were not going to allow millions of people into the country when there were already 25% unemployment. But nevertheless, they kept pushing, especially for Jewish immigrants from Europe, because at that time you had the rise of Hitler, and so they kept trying to change things, but nothing much changed until after World War II. The immigration battles heated up again. The 1952 law that was finally passed basically reaffirmed the 1924 law. It was passed over President Truman's veto. Jewish activist organizations were deeply involved in trying to overturn this legislation. So between 1952 and 1965, they never stopped. They kept creating organizations, funding organizations. Finally, by 1965, with the landslide of 1964, bringing Lyndon Johnson in, the Great Society and all that, the immigration law was finally overturned. All the ethnic quotas that were built into the 1924 law were overturned as racist. And it was promised at that time that it wouldn't change the ethnic balance of the country, but certainly in the minds of the activists who were behind it, that was just a ruse. They knew darn well that it was going to, that their attempt really was to change the ethnic balance of the country. And after that law was passed, one of the main goals was to simply increase the ceilings on immigration. In other words, to increase the absolute numbers. Once you got rid of ethnic origins as a criterion, other parts of the world were fair game. Reforms in immigration that have completely altered this country have not been the result of popular sentiment. They've been the result, really, of elite sentiment and frankly, ethnic interest group lobbying and so on. Since 1924, when they lost that, Jews have had a huge animosity towards the culture that did that. Jews, as I said, have, because they see Western culture as fundamentally anti-Jewish, going back to the Middle Ages, they have wanted to essentially end European domination of this society. And I think they're well on the way to doing that. Remember the 1965 immigration law, it was widely stated by Teddy Kennedy and many others that this act would not change the ethnic balance of the country. And yet the very same people who were behind this law immediately, as soon as it was passed, did everything they could to increase the numbers to the point now where it's about 1 million legal immigrants a year, plus uncounted hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants. The glaring double standard that we see here is apparent to anybody who even takes a casual look, and yet we still don't see any awareness of this in the media. You don't see any discussion of that. Very interesting to look at what Jewish organizations have done recently. They have allied with Mexican-American groups, other Hispanic groups. They have allied with Asian groups. They have allied with black groups. In other words, they see themselves as part of a coalition of ethnic groups. And they very self-consciously so. And those groups are going to become increasingly strong as time goes on because they're representing a greater and greater percentage of the population. But they see themselves, I think, as they have from the time they got here, as opposing the interests of European Americans. I don't think there's any question about that. People who oppose immigration, they talk about, well, there are economic problems and this and that. No one simply says, Europeans are not going to benefit from this as a group, that we are giving up control of our country to other peoples. That there is a huge problem with this. That when you are a minority group, you better hope that the other groups in society are nice to you. Well, we Europeans should be concerned that our future will be as a minority group. And we will then be at the whim of coalitions that may have very hostile intent towards us. That we will lose control of our own future. That's the issue here. It's as simple as that. But even raising European ethnic interests is the big taboo of of this period right now. We can't even raise the possibility that Europeans have ethnic interests. It's a taboo topic. And yet everybody else has ethnic interests, which are legitimate. I think that ethnic conflict, we can already see that on the horizon. And I think we're already getting to the point in this country, white people are now 70%. When you, as you get towards 50%, you're going to see increasing amounts of that, where other ethnic groups are simply going to start flexing their muscles, and they're going to demand, as we see now, greater presence of, say, Spanish in the public place. We're going to see more Spanish spoken in public arenas. We're going to see the decline of Western culture. We're going to see increases in affirmative action directed at underachieving minorities. And actually, affirmative action is a good example. University admissions. I mean, going to university, especially prestigious universities, is one of the tickets to upward mobility in the society. Well, you have different ethnic groups achieve at different levels. Asians achieve at levels higher than Europeans. So Europeans are going to get caught in the middle, and they're going to get caught between a very high-achieving Asian group, Jewish groups at the high end, and then between masses of Mexicans and blacks at the bottom, who are going to want equal representation. So whites are going to get squeezed out. And I think young white people are going to feel the brunt of this. The fact is, one of the problems I think right now is that most middle-class white people don't feel these pressures. Their children are going to feel them. And I think it's the children who are going to change and start to exert their interest. Because if they don't exert their interest, they're going to be the first group in history that hasn't exerted their interest. And it's as simple as that.
Minov is a former KGB agent.
Follows the statement of a very ancient Chinese philosopher, Sun Tzu, who was born 500 years BC, before Jesus Christ, who said something to the effect that fighting war on a battlefield is the most stupid and primitive way of fighting a war. The highest art of warfare is not to fight at all, but to subvert anything of value in your enemy's country, be it moral traditions, religion, respect to your authority and leaders, cultural traditions, anything. Put white against black, old against young, I don't know, wealthy against poor, and so on. Doesn't matter. As long as it disturbs society, as long as it cuts the moral fiber of a nation, it's good. And then you just take this country, when everything is subverted, when the country is disoriented and confused, when it is demoralized and then destabilized, then the crisis will come.